Lincoln Agritech, who are you and what do you do?
We are here on the campus of Lincoln University, but actually we are in one of the labs from Lincoln Agritech. Lincoln Agritech is a, I think, very unique company because we do very interesting projects around research and development for innovations, high-tech innovations for the primary industries. And we have researchers here, scientists, excellent scientists, smart engineers, and a lot of good technicians and administrative staff that help us to work in different projects for the primary industry, providing new sensors that help us to measure the environment or the actions on a farm, that helps the farmer or the consultant to make better decisions and later on also to improve productivity. So we are a company that is also doing research with national funds. So we compete with other organizations, but we are independent and we are privately organized. One of the teams here in Lincoln Agritech, almost 15 years ago, they started to look into a very specific problem in agriculture, a problem that is worldwide a problem, but with some special issues in New Zealand. And this is the movement of spray beyond the target, beyond the field that you want to spray, beyond the orchard, beyond the vine row that you want to spray. And this is the movement of droplets from that spray into, let's say, the neighboring environment. The droplets drift away, and this is the spray drift, and this can cause serious problems. A nice example of drift is actually at home. When somebody uses a perfume, you might, in a few seconds later, smell it in the next room. So it happens that also the movement in the house carries some of these droplets to the next place. And this happens also when we apply agricultural chemistries. The problem with agricultural chemistries, of course, they may also smell a little bit, hopefully not too bad, but in most cases they can also cause severe damages. They have an intention why farmers are spraying these agrochemicals, and therefore we can also cause effects somewhere else. We have 4 different possibilities that a spray can damage when it goes beyond the target, beyond the field, beyond the orchard. The first, of course, you lose spray. The amount of spray that the farmer has to apply is more because he loses some, and this is an economic loss. The next point, and this is more to the neighbors of that farmer, if you spray a chemical that drifts to some other areas, some other crops, this crop may be very sensitive to that spray. For instance, if you spray a herbicide on a paddock where you want to control weeds, this herbicide may really damage a vine row close by or that drifts into that area. And the same can happen with other crops. When you apply agrochemical, it can damage some other crop because the other crop is more sensitive to that. And it happens, and we have messages from wine growers here in New Zealand that claim several $100,000 of damage because some of their neighbors applied a herbicide to a paddock, and this spray drift then damaged that large vineyards. And it happens again and again, so we need to work around that problem and help farmers to get out of these problems. The second problem is also a damage to the neighbor. Some of the herbicides or some of the pesticides actually are registered, of course, to certain crops. Let's say a certain fruit crop, and when the drift from that, say, insecticide to kill some insects moves to the neighboring crop where this pesticide is not registered, you may have a problem in the importing country because they say you have some residues on your grapes or your kiwi fruits or your apples that is not allowed, but it came from some other crops. So we have damages that are very severe damages to some of the growers. The fourth example that we see with drift is when you have some organic growers that don't use synthetic pesticides. They, of course, don't want that a drift damages their crop or that some residues show up in their products. So we have problems that we want to tackle, and New Zealand has some specific issues with this. We have hedgerows or windbreaks. We have a high percentage of high value crops like fruits and vegetables. So spraying is a very, very important part of what is going on in New Zealand. And therefore, this country also subsidized research in the last 6 years to really find out what is happening when you have drift. What are the influencing, we call it driving forces. For instance, wind speed, wind direction, a shelter belt, how much can a shelter belt eventually really filter from that spray. And all this needs some research. And these kind of data are not available worldwide because not many other countries have, for instance, windbreaks or these kind of hedgerows. So we need to do this kind of research in New Zealand, and this was done with the MBRE project in the last 6 years. And we are happy that we are able to talk about that with you, with the growers, with the farmers, consultants. This was a project done by several other partners, Scion, the forestry research center in Rotorua, because they also have issues with spray and spray drift also in forestry. We work with a small company in Rotorua that looks for the pesticides on the leaves. Plant Protection Chemistry in New Zealand is a company, and we work with University of Otago because they look at a very specific problem of spray drift that I can talk about eventually later if you like.
What are you doing with the stuff behind us here?
This is our working lab, is the spray bench. This white object that you see at the right is a system that measures the size and the speed, how fast droplets move, and of course also we can measure the volume of the spray. This is a unique system, and eventually later Scott Post, our colleague from the United States, can explain how this works. It just measures very, very accurate the size, the droplet speed, and the volume of the spray. To the left you see a system that Rory Roten can explain to you, where we show farmers how you can reduce the risk of drift. We cannot go to zero, we will always have some drift. Drift is what happens when you spray, so we can only reduce the amount of drift. And we can show here if you spray less to some parts in the vineyard or in a crop where you don't have leaves or only a few leaves, then of course you reduce the amount of spray because you don't need to spray a gap between plants. So it's possible to reduce the amount of spray that we apply. And then of course we can also reduce the risk that it drifts. This is what we like to show here. The physics of spray and spray drift is very, very difficult because we have a phenomenon that is very important to understand. The best would be large droplets. Large droplets have the tendency just to drop down because they are heavy. But when you have a lot of large droplets, when you put them onto a leaf, they roll down. They don't touch or adhere to the leaves very easily. So the best would be have small drops, many, many small droplets, because then they can attach easily to the leaf. The problem is small droplets are lighter, so they can really travel very easily. They can sail with the wind, and like I said with the example in the house, you always have windy conditions. You don't have standstill of air movement, and this is a very difficult problem, of course, for New Zealand. You have almost every day, everywhere, windy conditions. So the farmers need to find out when they can apply the pesticide, when they can spray in situations where you have low wind speeds and eventually just no wind at all. So this is a problem that we need to find out. How can we change the spectrum of droplet size so that we avoid this drift? The best of what the farmer can do is really have his sprayer calibrated so that we know it's the right pressure, it's the right size of the nozzles, and very important is that the nozzles are not worn out. The good farmers do this on a regular basis, once a year, twice a year, eventually every second year. Those farmers that don't do that, they have a problem because some of them, they just bought the sprayer 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and they don't expect that something changes, but there's a lot of change. The nozzles wear out, we have pressure changes in the pumps, the pressure changes, so we are sure that there is a change in the quality of the spray. So the first thing is calibrate your sprayer, check it regularly. And the next thing is, of course, to talk with people that have experience what to do in spraying. So we have organizations like GrowSafe in New Zealand, or the Levitate organization that support farmers, Hort NZ, FAR. They all know what to do to have a perfect spraying set up for your conditions so that the farmers really can avoid this problem of drift, either the losses for himself or the risk for his neighbors.
What's happening internationally?
Internationally, everybody realizes drift is part of spraying. And as long as we cannot avoid that we need to spray, because this is the way how we apply agrochemicals to protect our crops, we have to accept that there is some spray. We need to reduce it. So most of the agencies that register pesticides, or the authorities like the EPA in the United States, also in New Zealand, they say we don't want to force you to have no drift. Let's talk about drift reduction technologies or procedures how to reduce drift. So this is a very important target for all of these organizations in New Zealand, and internationally overseas, just to show what is possible to have less drift going around. We also see more and more evidence that we don't need only to talk about the droplets that are drifting away. We also need to accept that some of the active ingredients that we spray, the chemicals that we want to use to protect a crop, can also evaporate into the air as a vapor, as a gas. And this gas, of course, can also travel with air. And when it travels much further than just the droplets, because vapor is almost weightless for the air, then you have, of course, very large distances where this vapor can later on condense and become a droplet when it gets colder and the vapor cools down and it drops down somewhere on other crops or somewhere in other environments, for instance in reserves, in natural reserves, where you probably are really curious and very sensitive about using pesticides, or they should not arrive there. So drift reduction technologies, vapor drift, long distance traveling of agricultural chemicals, and the next step is that companies that produce sprayers now look into new technologies to monitor what happens in that procedure of spraying. The best is, and we are working on that in our own group here, to have a sensor or several sensors that measures the drift on the go, so that the tractor driver, the contractor, knows you have a problem and can either change pressure on the sprayer or even stop spraying if it's too big a problem that spray happens. So the spraying companies want to improve their own gear just by improving the spraying quality on the boom and measure the way how drift is going on in the environment.